Chapter 19. A Champion Appears. It was late afternoon when Aiden left his brother's tent. He decided he might as well just go back home to Longleaf. There seemed nothing else for him to do in the battle camp. He had delivered the parcels to his brothers, and he could report back to his father that they were in good health. But this wasn't at all what he had imagined. Though there were still 2 hours of daylight left, Aiden decided it was best to find an out of the way place where he could lie down and sleep out the night before heading home in the morning. It had been an exhausting couple of days. He wandered through the camp, hardly even looking at the soldiers who stood in idle groups outside their tents. These men had been his heroes, the mighty men of Cornwall. Now he could hardly bear the sight of them. It was going to be a warm, cloudless night. Aiden would need no tent over his head. He picked a spot between two tents underneath the tent rope. He spread out the flour sack beneath him and used his panther cape for a cover. A chunk of firewood served as his pillow. By the time the evening star first appeared, he was sound asleep. But Aiden's sleep grew fitful around midnight when the camp was perfectly still and he was assailed by dreams. He dreamed of a Cornwall ruled by the Perthan Empire. He dreamed of the black and red banners of Perth fluttering over Tambluff Castle. He dreamed of live oaks felled and hewn into ribs for Perthan warships, of the singing longleaf pines planed to beams for Emperor Mardadud's newest palace. He dreamed of swamps, dreamed of Fiji folk in chains. He dreamed of the manor house burning once again. Aiden's homeland was a dark and unhappy place in those dreams. But then, just before daybreak, he had a dream of a different sort, a dream of salvation. He dreamed of the Wilder King coming out of the swamp to deliver Cornwall from his enemies. He wore a panther hide cape. Aiden woke with a start as the sun first peeped over the eastern horizon. He had a long way to go and was anxious to begin his journey home. But even though he was wide awake, his dreams of the previous night still troubled him. What did they mean? Did they mean anything at all? Except for the sentries and others with pre-dawn duties, a few soldiers were up and moving as Aiden made his way through the encampment back toward the western road. But Aiden recognized a familiar face as he passed by one of the few fires lit at the hour. Herschel, the messenger boy from the day before, sat hugging his knees and staring bleary-eyed into the fire. "Herschel," called Aiden. "It's me, Aiden Errolson. You helped me find my brothers yesterday." It took Herschel a second to free his attention from the fire's hypnotic pull. "Aiden?" he answered, and motioned towards the fire. "Come warm up." Aiden squatted beside the messenger boy and held his palms out toward the fire. "You don't look like you slept very well," he remarked. "True enough," answered Herschel. "I spent most of the night planning my future, a long life of slavery or a violent death, sometimes in the immediate future. That didn't leave much time for sleeping." "Don't talk like that," said Aiden. "Yesterday, you were the only person I could find in this whole camp who hadn't let that big-mouthed person get to you. Now you're acting like everybody else." "I know things today that I didn't know yesterday." "What sort of things?" asked Aiden. Herschel looked around and then leaned in close to whisper. "Yesterday afternoon, just as Grydal finished his daily performance, I delivered a message to the Perthan camp. And King Darrow is trying to surrender." The words hit Aiden like a fist to the stomach. His ears rang. Bright spots appeared in front of his face. Would Cornwall end like this? Would his countrymen not even go down fighting? Aiden managed to catch his breath. "What do you mean King Darrow is trying to surrender?" he asked. "Either you surrender or you don't." The Perthan commander said he would accept surrender only from a defeated foe. Aiden blinked. He didn't follow Herschel's meaning. "It means there's going to be a battle," explained Herschel. "Either a single combat between two champions or a pitched battle between the armies. We have 3 days to find a champion to fight Grydal. If no Cornwalder champion appears, the Persian army takes on the attacks on the third day. Both boys were silent as Aidan digested this information. Aidan remembered his dream of the previous night, of Cornwall subjugated and Cornwall delivered. He remembered Bayard's advice: live the life that unfolds before you. Love goodness more than you fear evil. At last, Aidan spoke. Herschel, I have a plan. Does it involve running away and not stopping until you're far, far from this place? That's the plan I've been working on. Aidan ignored him. I need a pen and some paper to write on. You're writing your will? Probably a good idea. Look in my pouch. Aidan found pen, ink, and palmetto paper in Herschel's messenger pouch. He quickly wrote a note and, folding it in two, nodded toward Herschel. Can you take me to King Darrow? King Darrow? Exclaimed Herschel. Are you crazy? Don't you suppose the king's got a lot on his mind? Just point me in the right direction. Herschel watched Aidan carefully for a few seconds, just to be sure he was serious. Herschel rose to his feet and, brushing firewood bark from his tunic, stepped out into the alley between the tent rows. Come on, then, he said, waving his hand for Aidan to follow. The king is always in the council tent, said Herschel, as the two boys walked through the awakening camp. All day, every day, he's in there with his generals and closest advisors. Some nights, he even sleeps there. Near the camp's center, Herschel pointed to a circle of large tents. Within the circle of tents were 4 or 5 larger tents. That's the command yard, he said. If you get past those 2 guards, the council tent is the biggest one inside the command yard. I don't know what you're up to. I don't even want to know. So I'm going to head back to my tent and let you do what you think you need to do. With that, he turned and walked back the way he came, slowly shaking his head and looking once or twice over his shoulder. Aidan took a deep breath as he prepared to face the guards at the entrance to the command yard. They were tall, strong men, square of jaw and stout of limb. Unlike the guards Aidan had encountered the previous day at the edge of camp, these were professional soldiers, the king's own bodyguard. As Aidan approached, their straight-ahead stare never changed. They maintained the same impassive expression as the boy spoke. Ahem. Pardon me. I have a note for King Darrow. Neither of the guards acknowledged him. Aidan spoke a little louder. I have a note for King Darrow. No response. A champion has presented himself to face the Persian champion. At this, the guards looked at one another. One of them nodded, and the other reached out a hand toward Aidan. Aidan gave the paper to the guard, who disappeared into the tent. Neither of the guards had spoken a word. I'll just wait here, called Aidan to the tent flap. 3 or 4 minutes later, the guard emerged from the tent. The king will see you, he said. Aidan followed the guard into the tent, then into another tent, inside the first, the inner chamber of the council tent. Here, surrounded by charts and maps and battlefield models, sat King Darrow in a chair, along with 7 or 8 generals and noblemen. Aidan looked at the men around the table. He had seen most of them at Longleaf at one time or another. His own father, no doubt, would have been among this group if not for his stroke. Then Aidan's mouth dropped open in astonishment. At King Darrow's right hand sat a barrel-chested old man with blazing white hair and green eyes that seemed to see more deeply than any others. On the ground in front of him sat 2 goats, a Billy and a Nanny. He had cut his hair and cleaned himself up, but there was no answer. No question. This was Bayard, the truth speaker, sitting at the right hand of the king himself in the seat of the chief adviser. Aidan stared at the prophet in disbelief. Bayard's expression, on the other hand, did not betray the least bit of surprise. Rather, the little smile, the raised eyebrows, the upward tilt of the head, all said as clearly as he had spoken. Ah, there you are, young Aidan Errolson. I knew you'd come soon. The voice of the king brought Aidan back to reality. Darrow held the note in front of him and was reading aloud. Your Majesty, I will fight the Persian champion, and so spare the shedding of any additional Cornwalder blood. You determine the time and place, and I will be there to fight for Cornwall. Yours sincerely, Aidan Errolson of Longleaf Manor. The king looked over the paper at Aidan. And our champion, this Aidan Errolson, why has he sent a messenger boy instead of coming himself? Well, your Majesty, you see, began Aidan. Errol's eldest son is named Brennus, is he not? Interrupted the king. Yes, sire, answered Aidan. Brennus is the eldest of the brothers. So this Aidan is the second Errolson? The fifth, your Majesty, answered Aidan. The fifth? No, you must be confused. Errol's fifth son would be no bigger than you are. True enough, sire. I am Aidan Errolson. The king looked again at the signature on the letter and gave a short bark of surprise. You can't be serious. Bayard smiled and spoke to the king. Oh, he's serious, your Majesty. I've met Aidan Errolson. This is he. Darrow turned toward the prophet at his right hand. But he can't face the Persian champion? He turned back to Aidan. Boy, have you seen this Grydal? I have seen him, your Majesty. I have heard of his cruelty and the thousands of men he has slain. But I also know him to be a boaster and a blasphemer against the one true God. King Darrow shook his head. I admire your bravery, lad, but you cannot possibly. The king broke off. The whole idea was so ridiculous, he didn't even finish his sentence. Aidan stood a little straighter. His face was set in a steely gaze of determination. Your Majesty, I cannot hear our enemies speak against Cornwall and the one God without giving answer. There's an unspoken rebuke in Aidan's response, a rebuke against a king who had yet to answer Grydal and whose cowardice had brought his kingdom to the brink of ruin. Darrow heard this rebuke, and it angered him. Insolent boy, he said through the clenched teeth. He pointed toward the tent entrance. Go home where you belong. There you won't have to hear the giant's taunts. Aidan stood his ground. If I go home, your Majesty, I should hear Grydal's taunts all the more. I should become like the soldiers outside this tent who hear the Persian voice so clearly that they cannot hear the voice of God. Darrow looked away. Away with you, boy. Go home. I have much to think about. His voice was softer now. I don't need the blood of children on my hands. Aidan looked to Bayard for help, but Bayard was silent. He just sat with that faint smile on his face. When two guards approached Aidan from either side to escort him out, Aidan grew desperate. Your Majesty, he blurted out, I know you've tried to surrender to the Persians. The guards stopped in their tracks and looked at Darrow, not sure what to do. Aidan continued, and I know the Persians insist on a battle. The king sat stone-faced, neither confirming nor denying Aidan's claims. Sire, continued Aidan, if you have already given hope of defeating the Persians, either army to army or champion to champion, what would it hurt if I faced Grydal? Do you have a soldier who can defeat him? Darrow was silent still. One of his generals spoke up at last. Your Majesty, the boy has a point. We cannot defeat the Persians in a pitched battle. We have no fighting man who could hope to defeat the Persians' champion in single battle. The boy's offer may be the best we can hope for. The Persians will have the blood they require, and we will lose no soldiers. If the boy wishes to die for Cornwall, added Lord Selwyn, why not let him? Darrow looked into the face of each member of the war council, one after the other. In his turn, each man nodded, a barely perceptible nod, with eyes averted. The king drew a deep breath. Well, that settles it, doesn't it? Cornwall has a champion.